Thank you for joining us tonight for our event with Michael Branch and Nick Neely to discuss Michael's new book, On the Trail of the Jackalope, How a Legend Captured the World's Imagination and Helped Us Cure Cancer. I'm Lane Jacobson, the owner of Paulina Springs Books in Sisters, Oregon. Before I properly introduce our guest this evening, just a couple of housekeeping items. If you're having any technical difficulties, we recommend exiting and re-entering the Zoom session. And if that doesn't work, this event is also streaming at the Books in Common Northwest YouTube page, which is also where you can find a recording of this event after it concludes. For any audio issues, we recommend first plugging in some headphones, as that usually does the trick, and then probably revisiting that recording at a later time. A reminder also that this is a shared creative space, and we ask that everyone in attendance be respectful of other attendees. Any offensive behavior or questions will result in being kicked out of the session. And lastly, a reminder that this is part of a virtual event series called Books in Common Northwest, which is presented by Paulina Springs Books in Sisters, Oregon, Country Bookshelf in Bozeman, Montana, and Madison Books in Seattle, Washington. We have an event coming up this Thursday that we're very excited about with Leah Thomas for her new book, The Intersectional Environmentalist: How to Dismantle Systems of Oppression to Protect People and Planet. You can register for that event and any other upcoming events at booksincommonnw.com. You'll see a little Q&A button at the bottom of your screen where you can submit your own questions for our guests this evening that you'd most like to hear. And you can also upvote the questions that you would like us to make sure that we get to. And throughout the evening, we'll also be dropping a link into the chat where you can purchase Michael's book. And with all of that out of the way, I'm going to introduce our guests for the evening and then pass things off to them. Nick Neely holds an MA in Literature and the Environment from the University of Nevada, Reno, and MFAs in Nonfiction and Poetry from Hunter College and Columbia University, and is the recipient of numerous writing and journalism awards. His newest book, Alta California, an LA Times bestseller, details his 12-week trek from San Diego to San Francisco, there it is, to retrace the first overland Spanish expedition through California. Originally from San Francisco Bay Area, he now lives with his wife in La Grande, Oregon, where he is an assistant professor at Eastern Oregon University and teaches in EOU's low residency MFA program with a concentration in wilderness ecology and community. Michael Branch is a professor of literature and environment at the University of Nevada, Reno, where he teaches creative nonfiction, American literature, environmental studies, and film studies. An award-winning writer and humorist, Michael is the author of Rants from the Hill and How to Cuss in Western. He lives with his wife and 2 daughters in the Western Great Basin Desert on the eastern slope of the Sierra Nevada Range. Without further ado, I'm going to pass things off to our guests, and I'll be back later in the evening to field some questions from the audience. Welcome, Michael and Nick.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
I thought I'd just start off by saying it's a real honor and pleasure to be able to chat with Mike tonight. I was under Mike's wing tutelage as a 22-year-old at the University of Nevada, Reno, and he's been an amazing mentor to me. And reading his latest book, On the Trail of the Jackalope, was just an incredibly rewarding experience. So, Mike, I know I've got lots of questions for you, but I thought you should first give your overview of the book. And thanks again for inviting me to participate in this conversation.
Oh, thanks for being with me. I should say too that you might have been 22, but you were already editing my work then and doing a great job at it. So I feel like we've been fellow travelers. And before I get started, I want to make sure that I make everybody aware of Nick's work too. He is a wonderful science writer, environmental writer, and a writer from the Northwest. And his first book, Coast Range, is a sort of multi-generic approach to representations of beautiful landscapes in the Pacific Northwest. And then his most recent book, Alta California, which is an absolute masterwork, is just an incredible book in which Nick walks all the way down the coast of California, retracing the steps of the earliest explorers to visit the region. And the book is this wonderful counterpoint between how the region was represented when it was first seen by explorers, and then how it looks to Nick as he walks through this landscape that's part wild, part suburban, part urban. It's just an amazing book. So Alta California And the indies that are participating in sponsoring this event have it. So I would really recommend the book to you. Before I get started too, I just wanted to thank Lane and also Jess for putting this together for us. As far as I'm concerned, you know, independent bookstores and breweries, no community can live without them, right? And so the survival of these businesses really depends on our support, you know. So please do, whether it's our books or somebody else's books, please do support your indies, including these 3 fantastic stores that are hosting this event tonight. So I thought what I would do is just give you guys a quick overview of this book and then just read you a little snippet at the beginning to kind of give you a feel for the journey that is represented in the book. And then Nick and I are just going to talk, which I think is more engaging than, you know, being read at all night. So this book, if you're familiar with a jackalope in the traditional sense, it's a hoax mount. It's a joke, right? It's a rabbit that has deer's antlers or pronghorn horns. And so we think of that hoax mount as sort of the beginning of this jackalope tradition. Then there's all this kitsch that issues from it, right? All the t-shirts and keychains and snow globes and junk that comes from this. So in the book, I sort of divide the project into 3 parts. The first is to look at that original jackalope origin story. In the 1930s, 2 teenagers who lived outside a little town called Douglas, Wyoming, were taking an amateur correspondence course in taxidermy. And they got this crazy idea that they would try to mount deer horns on a rabbit. That was where the hoax mount began. From that, eventually, the horned rabbit kitsch and art makes its way not only through the American West, but around the country and eventually around the world. So when I started out, it was, how did this weird idea that these 2 kids in Depression era Wyoming had, how did that end up captivating our imagination and spreading around the world? So I look at the folklore and mythology, hoaxes, that kind of stuff. In the middle part of the book, I kind of go on an international hunt to see if there are horned rabbits in other cultures. And it turns out they're all over the world. Precursors and analogs to the American jackalope exist in indigenous cultures throughout the Americas, through Europe. Horned rabbits are in African folk tales, and even in ancient texts emerging from Asia and the Arabic world. So for example, I've found 3 different Buddhist sutras in which the Buddha actually uses the horned rabbit as a teaching tool. So I kind of relate the jackalope to all of these international cousins. And then I look at the jackalope in the arts, jackalopes in literature, in film, in computer games, in sculpture, in the visual arts. And the book has a really beautiful color insert with lots of this amazing jackalope artwork. And then the last third of the book is the kind of surprising turn. It's sort of the story behind the story. And it sort of goes like this, to give you the compressed version. Quote unquote horned rabbits actually exist in nature. And your average jackalope lover would not, of course, know this. The weird growths that occur on these rabbits are caused by infection from a papillomavirus. And so in the book, I tell the story of a virologist who in the 1930s is the first person to study these weird growths on rabbits. And without getting too nerdy, I'll just summarize and say that his work is the first time that anybody proved that a virus could cause cancer in a mammal. And that's a super big deal because, of course, human beings are also stricken with HPV-caused cancers that are caused by viruses. About 10% of global cancer deaths each year are caused by viruses. So I tell the story of how this guy's study of horned rabbits, connect a few dots, eventually leads to the development of the HPV vaccine, the world's safest and most effective anti-cancer vaccine. So that's a quick overview of the book that, you know, it goes from kitsch to art to global analogs to ultimately this science story of how horned rabbits have really, in some ways, sort of saved us. So that's a summary. I thought what I would do is just read for you guys the author's note, which is just a 5-minute read. It's the text right at the beginning of the book. And in some ways it says what I've just said, but it sort of sets the terms for the journey that I try to take in the book. And then after that, Nick's going to ask me some questions and we're just going to have a conversation. And I'm really looking forward to that. So this is only going to take about 5 minutes, and hopefully it'll help give you a sense of the context and the arc of the book. And this is called Down the Rabbit Hole. I wish I could say exactly where I was when I first saw a jackalope. I was just a kid, and my initial response to the odd bunny was grinning fascination. I recall wondering if the animal was real and hoping like hell that it was. while also realizing that even if it wasn't, something wonderful was before my eyes. What charmed me most was the way the hybrid horned rabbit crossed boundaries, refusing to be either this thing or that thing, a form of resistance any kid struggling to navigate the adult world can appreciate. It also seemed to satirize the genre of the hunting trophy mount, a form of nature commemoration that even as a boy I had difficulty comprehending. The jackalope struck me as inherently playful, at once cute and funny, but still out to fool you if it could. Like all good humorists, the jackalope always keeps a straight face, taking itself seriously, no matter how much it might make us laugh. Since my boyhood introduction to the jackalope, my appreciation for this bizarre creature has deepened immeasurably. The jackalope is now ubiquitous in American culture. Everywhere I travel, I see jackalope mounts, jackalope kitsch, bumper stickers and postcards, beer and whiskey, bands and songs, teams and clubs, bars and restaurants. Unlike many other widely disseminated cultural phenomena, think Disney here, nobody owns the jackalope, and no corporation or person is entitled to control its production, distribution, or interpretation. The jackalope's like a plant whose burr catches on your sock and hitches a ride to its next home. Only the plant is comic folk art, and its burr instead catches your imagination, convincing you to blow $10 on a jackalope shot glass that you just can't help but bring home. Anyone who's bought a Save the Jackalopes t-shirt or stuck a stamp on a tacky jackalope postcard or shared a funny jackalope image on social media has unwittingly been a vector of the horned rabbit's viral transmission. Because the jackalope also migrates through narrative, I meet plenty of people who claim to have seen one and who will regale me with extravagant stories that are always worth the price of a pint. As a storyteller myself, what I love about the jackalope is that there's such a rich story behind it, and yet more layers of narrative behind even that story still to be discovered. Once endemic to the American West, the jackalope has spread far beyond its home range and now inhabits the broader culture. Embodying animal hybridity in fascinating, comical ways that test our credulity, generate legends, and captivate the imagination, the irresistible horned rabbit is now a beloved staple of popular culture, folklore, and humor around the globe. But the jackalope is much more than an article of iconic kitsch. Its connection to actual horned hares in nature leads us beyond hoax, humor, and folk narrative into a scientific quest to save human lives by understanding the viruses that cause growths on rabbits and cancers in people. I am seeking the real story behind the strangest, funniest, most weirdly appealing animal ever invented. I've been obsessed with this little beast for 2 decades, and I've at last committed myself unconditionally to its discovery. As a result, I am about to go down a fascinating rabbit hole. I am on the trail of the true tale of the jackalope. My quest is to understand how a peculiar horned rabbit, born of the inventiveness of a couple of kids in Depression-era rural Wyoming, ended up capturing the world's imagination, and how the study of its real-life counterpart, the horned hare, resulted in Nobel Prize-winning research that ultimately led to development of the world's safest and most effective anti-cancer vaccine. When tracking the jackalope, it's helpful to have an open mind and a fertile imagination. I'm reminded of an exchange between Lewis Carroll's Alice and the White Queen. "One can't believe in impossible things," insists Alice. "I dare say you haven't had much practice," responds the Queen. "Why, sometimes I believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast." Pursuing the elusive horned rabbit will lead us from the liminal world of the trickster back to the solid reality of nature, through the fragility of our own bodies, then home again to the inexhaustible universe of the imagination. That odd little antlered bunny you've chuckled at in a bar or gift shop, in fact, has a complex, fascinating, and surprising story, one that deserves to be told. So I hope that's helpful in kind of setting the terms of the quest of the book, and the fact that I'm going after this myth to understand everything I can about it, but also to understand the stories behind the stories that are essentially part of what the jackalope is. So there's a little introduction. I hope you enjoyed it. And Nick, let's talk.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for such a pleasure to hear you read from this out loud. And it's a really fantastic author's note that does, it's just sort of the perfect teaser for the many rabbit holes that the book gracefully goes down. And that's something I want to talk about, is how you take on as much disparate material as you do and make it all work through the eye of the jackalope. But before we get to that, you mentioned in this author's note that this is a two-decade obsession, and I'm really thrilled and relieved for you that the book has come out. Not that it's going to end the obsession, but it's an important milestone in any obsession, the production. I guess my question is, can you tell us more? Can you tell the audience and me about what was the precipitating factor for why this book in this moment? And we all know that a book, doesn't exist in a single moment, and that maybe many books are born out of long-term obsessions. I know John McPhee, has said that everything he's written was something he was interested in as a boy at camp. But why now? What was it that suddenly made you realize this was a book?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I looked back in my journal actually after the book was published, and the first entries about the jackalope are over 20 years old. And the very first one was, hey, the word jackalope is not in the dictionary. What is up with that? Mermaid is in there, unicorn is in there. Jackalope is, this iconic mythic beast of the American West. We should get our mythic beast in the dictionary. And I actually had hatched this plan to, create a campaign to get the word in the dictionary, which it now is. But I think for me, the project really spoke to me because, first of all, I'm a humor writer. Secondly, I love to write about the American West. Third, I love to do popular science writing, which is something you are so gifted at. And finally, I like to write about these weird nature culture nexes, just places where something seems to be both natural and cultural at the same time in ways that are weird and funny. That always attracts my imagination. So it really felt like the project was in my wheelhouse. But you're right, it took a long time to cook. I'd published 3 or 4 other books, 5 books in the meantime. But I think part of it was I've always loved how whimsical the jackalope is, but I've always been curious about it, first of all, its origin story, and then secondly, how it was so widely disseminated. I mean, it just seemed like everywhere I went, I saw jackalopes. And that's partly a result of my own obsession. That's just kind of my personality. But the defining moment, I was in my local brew pub and I saw a woman hoist a pint and she had a jackalope tattoo on her arm. And I thought, okay, enough is enough. This thing is everywhere. I need to figure out what the story is. But when I first started digging, I had no idea how complex and interesting it was really going to be.
Yeah, I mean, the jackalope, as soon as you have an eye for it, it certainly does start to pop out at you everywhere. And in your case, I think it was, it was trailing you before you started trailing it. I never would have guessed that it was the tattoo at a brew pub that would have been the precipitating factor. To my mind, I was thinking, oh, maybe he's going to say, when he learned about the connection to actual horned rabbits and the connection to cancer research and breakthroughs, that gives the story of the jackalope a particular kind of stakes. I mean, and you show how it has stakes in so many dimensions. But that's a stake that maybe a lot of people could see really clearly, a lot of readers. So maybe just as a follow-up question, when did you learn about that, and was it an influence in terms of bearing down on the book?
Yeah, it was. I will say that most of what I learned about the human papillomavirus, cancer, the vaccine. Most of that I learned through subsequent research. So I knew that there were rabbits in the natural world that had these weird growths. And I thought to myself, okay, that's strange, right? We have the jackalope that's invented as a mythical creature, and then we have these actual horned rabbits in nature. Is there some relationship between the two that I can explore? As it turns out, and this is just a coincidence, but it's a coincidence that captured my imagination. 1932 was the year that the virologist who studied horned rabbits began his work. 1932 was also the year that, at least according to them, those teenagers in rural Wyoming invented the first jackalope. And I thought, wow, isn't this fascinating? We have this origin story that begins in the same year. And even if it's coincidental, it also suggests that these two narratives are running parallel to each other. And how does that work? In terms of the science part of the story, I think the most gratifying part of this was Richard Shope, the virologist who I mentioned. He's a guy who is pretty much sunk out of view in terms of science history and medical history. Because I'm an obsessive researcher, I managed to track down his two surviving children, both of whom are in their mid-80s. We became friends, and as they came to trust me, they started sharing with me this unbelievable cache of unpublished letters, manuscripts, photographs. And so, using archival research and this unpublished material, I was able for the first time to actually tell the full story of how important Shope's research was. And it's been kind of neat because, his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, will email me and say, we're so proud of him. We're so glad that this story finally got told. So that's an example of a technique that you're familiar with, where, if you want to talk about super nerdy stuff, it helps to have a character whose progress you can trace. So I'm trying to educate my reader about HPV and about the emergence of the vaccine, but I try to do it with stories that involve characters so that it's more engaging and less nerdy.
He's an incredible character. It's Shope?
Shope, yep.
Shope? Yeah, I mean, basically, you do tell us that he might well have won a Nobel Prize, right? If he had pursued the leads that he made in terms of the virus and rabbits, and he generously handed it over to a colleague who was maybe more established in the field. And I love the parallel that you drew to the way in which he sort of just like gave this finding to the world and to his colleagues specifically, and it grew from there, right? And it helped everyone. And you draw a nice parallel to the way that the jackalope itself was sort of like given over to the world and has traveled in so many different directions, in kitschy ways and in really sort of magical ways. And I guess, I'm already off my script of questions, but we're on the subject of virology all of a sudden, and it was really interesting to see you work with that parallel and the metaphor, the idea of the jackalope disseminating via various vectors, folklore, kitsch, and comparing it to actual, virology. And so when is that something that developed in the writing of the book? Did you see it from far off, and was it a generative connection for you that helped you think about both subjects?
It did emerge, but what captivated me originally was this idea that, the jackalope is not a Warner Brothers cartoon character. It's not a Disney product. It's everybody's because it's nobody's. And I just love that idea that the folk process is essentially what disseminates the jackalope throughout culture. And as you know from the book, I do lots and lots of interviews with lots of different people, from, postcard collectors and cryptozoologists and, just people to virologists and oncologists and epidemiologists and, medical historians. And so I talked to this whole range of people. And the last question that I ask in every single interview is, why do you think people love jackalopes? And what's really cool is, over the course of the book, emerges this constellation of responses where you realize, oh, people love the jackalope, but they don't love it for the same reason. Each person is engaged in it for a particular reason. Visual artists love it for one reason, humorists love it for another. Everybody has their own take on it. So I was just really interested in that. Nobody owns it, and yet it makes its way everywhere. This powerful cultural dissemination of this thing, like nobody's in charge of this thing. And what's been kind of interesting is when I work with Jackalope Folklore, I will now often add a layer of my own. So, Jackalope Folklore includes stuff like, jackalopes are so rare because they only mate during lightning storms,
Right.
or jackalope milk is a known aphrodisiac and does sleep on their back, but it's far too dangerous to milk them, or jackalopes can only be attracted with a bowl of whiskey at night. So there are all these great, folk stories about jackalopes. And one of the most common is the idea that, hey, if you're ever out camping, and you're around the campfire, the way cowboys would have been, if you start to sing a song, you'll often hear the jackalope begin to sing with you. So people still tell this story around the West. And I've met lots of people who said, oh yeah, I tell that story to my grandkids or my nephews or nieces, and we sing around the fire and they listen, they're trying to listen for the jackalope. So I just found myself riffing on stuff like that and saying like, well, that's true. We know that's true, but there's also a lot of misinformation out there about this. And for example, yes, of course, jackalopes sing, and of course they will harmonize with you, but many people claim that the jackalope harmonizes by singing the bass part. That's absurd. That's just an example of this kind of, misinformation that spreads. It's the treble part of the song. So, you find yourself retelling these jackalope stories, and it's irresistible to sort of add a layer. And so that was what got me interested originally, is how does this thing disseminate so widely? But then, when I studied Shope and I realized that this guy who ultimately died of cancer himself handed off his project with no sense of competition or entitlement, handed off his project, as you say, to these other folks. And the two people who inherited his work most directly both won the Nobel Prize. And ultimately, we end up with the HPV vaccine. So I love the idea that both Shope and the brothers who invented the jackalope gave something to the world, and yet nobody tried to own or brand or control it. If you want to write a song about a jackalope or make a painting or write a book, that's your jackalope. And I just love that idea that, it's the folk process that keeps this alive. At the end of the book, I more or less say, the only possible cause of the extinction of the jackalope would be a failure of imagination on our part, our unwillingness to continue to tell the stories.
Yeah, one of the favorite phrases from the book is you describe, I think it's very late, you describe the jackalope as or you're quoting someone else, a vector of the imagination. That just seems perfect. And you can see that it's infected you so, incredibly deeply. And I was going to I had a question all queued up about the way in which you sort of toe the line between tall tale and treatise in this book, and the jackalope's language too. I was going to point to one of those examples. You describe how he can kind of ventriloquize or throw his voice and say, "There he goes over there," which is sort of accepted jackalope biology or myth. And then you go on to do serious analysis of this and say, I will add, quote unquote, I will add that jackalope's use of human language as a deceptive tactic gives the lie to those who argue that the animal only mimics our language without understanding its meaning. And it's a great deduction, right? But it's also just the extension of the myth into the absurd. And I came to see the book, kind of in the play in general, as I think you've already described. And it sounds like that is something that you sort of set out to do. You knew you were gonna play with that, and as a humorist, that was sort of on the agenda from the beginning.
Yeah, for sure. And if you want to really get an example of this, you can check out my book trailer for On the Trail of the Jackalope, which we just made public the other day. And I don't want to give anything away about it except to say that in the trailer, let's put it this way, I play a writer who has written a book about a jackalope, and I'm being interviewed for a documentary about my writing process. And enough to say that my answers about jackalopes are much more designed to perpetuate the myth than to dissect or explode it. So yeah, I feel like I am trying to help people understand how fascinating and funny and cool this thing is, this phenomenon, but also to help promote it, to keep it alive, to be the next layer of storytelling. So I appreciate you noticing that.
it doesn't hit you over the head, right? And sometimes it can be, you're like, whoa, wait a second, he made this up, and you play with it really delicately. I love that aspect of the book. There's another, I don't want to give too much away, but there's a moment where, early on, you described going on what we might see as like a traditional, not a nature walk, but an excursion out into the landscape, right, with your daughters. And it's an example of really, world-class nature writing. And we can problematize that term all day long. But you do, as you set up this scene, this passage, you kind of create a composite of the landscape, talking about its geology, natural history of the pronghorn antelope, and as if you're into nature writing, you're totally on board with this. You're like, wow, this is right up my alley. And then it gets weird, and you start questioning yourself as a reader, like, what is real? Were any of these facts real? And it plays into your discussion of the hoax. So another example, but I wanted to bring that up because it seemed to me like that was a nod to the genre convention, a certain kind of old school environmental writing. To what extent, maybe you've already touched on this a little, but to what extent was this book, from the start, an attempt to like push back on that mode of kind of a walk in the woods or walk in the desert in this case? How did you find new ways of doing that via the Jackalope?
Well, yeah, as you know, I've done a lot of place-based writing, mostly from the Great Basin Desert, and I take that seriously, whether you want to use the term nature writing, environmental writing, place-based writing. But
Right.
I do consider myself a high desert writer, and I take a lot of pleasure in natural history writing. But I also find that, no shade on my colleagues, but a lot of our friends who write natural history, you have to come to it already loving that subject. You have to already sort of have your nerd eyes on when you come to it. And I have experimented a lot more in recent years with using storytelling and humor writing as ways into environmental writing, because I think it's important that we try to expand our audience, and not just sort of be preaching to the choir. So yeah, part of what I was up to here is I want to educate people about natural history, whether I'm writing about the desert or HPV virus. But I think that, we have to enrich our toolbox so that we're not just sort of like, creating narratives that read like textbooks. That just doesn't reach audiences. And so I really like the idea that, well, nature writing is a way of kind of describing and celebrating what's out there in the natural world. But what's cool about the Jackalope is that it reminds us that when we imagine our relationship to nature, we have to have a place not just for observation, but for imagination. So one of the key ideas that I use in the book, I borrow this from Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges, is the idea of the necessary monster. I love that Borges term, the necessary monster.
Right.
And Borges makes the point, hey, every world culture in its folklore has monsters, has imaginary beings, has hybrid animals. And why is that? It's because we need that in some way. That is the landscape of nature that speaks to our imagination rather than our observation. So I wanted to really combine those two and sort of use my chops as a nature writer to bring people into a world, but use my imagination to bring them into a world that also includes fantasy and myth. And so far as hoax goes, there's a big difference between a hoax and a con, right? A con is trying to rip somebody off and have them never figure out how you did it. A hoax is playful. It's intended to be exposed. And when a hoax is exposed, it's designed to bring people into a sense of community. Hey, I fooled you with the jackalope. I got a good laugh out of it. Now you and I will fool the next person. And so there's this kind of intergenerational work that happens too. But I just love this idea that, I sometimes joke and, tell my daughters like, hey, the two coolest things you can be in the world are absolutely real or absolutely imagined. And the jackalope has figured out how to do both at once.
Yeah, one of the sort of key tensions, as I maybe simplify it in the book, is that we could see the jackalope as a symbol of wonder. The idea of a hoax brings us to our attention, for example. and also of transgression, or the jackalope being a form of resistance, right? And we could see, within the sweep of environmental writing, like maybe wonder is that early wave, and now we're thinking about ways in which we can look at things and discover modes of resistance. I'm taking too long to ask all my questions. I wanted to just, there's this amazing line early in the book. You're describing, you've gone to Douglas, Wyoming, where the first mount was made, and maybe that's the origin of the jackalope, which is something you wrestle with over the course of the book, which is cool, rather than accepting it as face value. And of course you wouldn't, but you take a photo of this of the shadow of a jackalope sculpture, and you kind of disappear into the shadow in a second snapshot, and then you deliver this great line. Maybe the jackalope is best understood by the shadow it casts, even when our shadow is hidden within it. And I, sort of midway through the book, that line really stuck with me, and it became a way for me to understand the book, which it was exploring all the corners of the jackalope's shadow, the way it really is teaching us about all the different kinds of subjects which you've listed. And I wonder, could you tell us what is sort of like the surprising corners of the jackalope's shadow that you discovered along the way, and maybe either relished lingering in, or thought were particularly challenging and not maybe in your comfort zone as a writer and researcher?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, when I think of the shadow cast by the jackalope, part of what I think of is, right, the imagination strikes this object and then it produces something. But throughout the book, as I ask this question of everybody, why do you love jackalopes? One person, I interviewed a guy who created a website where people can write in with their jackalope sighting narratives. It was just absolutely hilarious. So the shadow that's being cast there is people who are just have these outrageous tongue-in-cheek narratives about, the time the jackalope attacked and ate their grandmother in the forest or whatever. Just these outrageous stories that are so, that are so funny. And then, other people like the wife of the mayor of Douglas, when I interviewed her, I mean, she almost had tears in her eyes. It was completely unironic, completely sincere. And she said, when we were kids, Jackalope was like our Santa Claus or our Easter Bunny. We left oats out for him at night. And she told me the story of when her cousin told her Jackalope wasn't real, and she had to go ask her grandmother about it and how difficult that was for her. So, compare those two things. A jackalope ate my grandmother, and, I cried when I learned that Jackalope wasn't real. And I interview writers and musicians and artists too. And I say, hey, you've made this beautiful painting of a jackalope, or you've written this song about a jackalope. What does it mean to you? And somebody would tell me it's a metaphor for a spiritual journey. And then somebody else would tell me it's a symbol of the melting of different perspectives and its hybridity. And the point is, everybody had these like heartfelt and compelling answers, but their answers were all different. So I really liked that idea that you can't just point at a jackalope and say, there's the thing, because what really matters is that the jackalope functions as a kind of Rorschach test, like an ambiguous ink blot test. Everybody sees both a window and a mirror. And so that was really fascinating for me. In terms of what was uncomfortable for me, I will say that the central role of taxidermy in this story was really different for me. I'm not a hunter. I'm not a taxidermist. And so some of those interviews were uncomfortable for me, but also some of the most gratifying, because they took me out of my comfort zone and introduced me to people I would never have met. And at the very end of the book, as you know, the last thing that dawns on me once I have this draft of the manuscript done is I'm totally obsessive. I've traveled all over the country talking to people about jackalopes, but there's one stone I've left unturned. I haven't tried to make a jackalope myself. And so having interviewed taxidermists in South Dakota and Wyoming, I find myself in this jackalope making workshop in the Mission District of San Francisco with these hipsters. And it's pretty gross and it's pretty disturbing in certain ways. And so as a writer, I try to be honest about the fact that, oh yeah, a jackalope mount is a kind of beautiful joke, but it also requires a sort of death. And how do I feel about that? So I try to end the book, being honest about the reservations I have about that aspect of it. This doesn't apply to a jackalope snow globe or oven mitt, but so far as the mount is concerned, an animal dies to produce that thing.
Here's the result. There's Paxton, Mike's taxidermy. Jackalope.
Yes,
He's really handsome.
the irony of that, Nick, is that I was by far the worst student in the class, and my teacher was
You
fond of
wrote.
pointing that out. Yeah, it's just said, you're awful. You're not only the worst student in this class, you might be the worst taxidermy student I've ever had in my life. You're so bad. And my jackalope, Paxton, came out awful. It was just terrible. But I wanted a picture of the jackalope for the book. So I took my mount down to a friend who's a professional photographer and said, hey, can you shoot a high-res image of this for me? And I got this jackalope glam shot. He brushed him, he lit him perfectly. And so you'll see my description in the book is he looks awful. And then he gets this full page glossy.
I was wondering about that.
He looks incredible, So believe me, in real life, he does not look that good.
Well, I mean, kudos to your photographer friend, but it's completely appropriate, right, for the jackalope to be a little bit, Photoshop touched up. We wouldn't really want it any other way. I mean, the taxidermy thread is amazing, and actually helped really. I've had a fascination with taxidermy, that I've never really interrogated. And I actually in Alta California, I go into a taxidermist shop, just kind of like walking by, and write up a pretty long scene about it. But I'll never think about taxidermy in the same way. Having read your book, it's just such a complicated art form, and it really is an art form, and your appreciation for these artists is really impressive, even as you are, sort of asking the hard questions when you look into a freezer and see, 650 bloody rabbit pelts there, and that, animals are dying. And you can see the way, the book models the evolution of your thinking about ethics over the course of it, which is really nice. Even if that's just something that you created after the fact, that I know you already had a complex view of our relationship to animals. But I digress. The question I wanted to ask you is, in the book, you're talking so much about the art of taxidermy, right? And there's a moment also where someone, I think one of the taxidermists asks you about book writing or makes a comparison. And I wondered whether you started, in the writing of this, you started thinking about taxidermy as a metaphor for book writing, or to what extent, like, there's something we can learn from taxidermy as writers. And I of course thought about the root of the word, which is so compelling, that to organize the skin, right? Taxidermy, which you nicely explain in the book. Anything there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, the real connection is hybridity. The jackalope is hybrid, and the kind of creative nonfiction that I'm trying to write is hybrid. I mean, if somebody asked me, is this a science book? Is it an environmental book? Is it a book of creative writing? Is it a humor book? I would say yes. But as you know, Nick, the publishing industry doesn't always look kindly on hybridity, because it's not easy to brand and market. But
no, they don't. They do.
No,
not.
they don't. It's a painful thing. But I think as writers, we have to do what we're called to do. And I just felt like the generic hybridity of the book was necessary to tell the story of this hybrid animal. And so for me, taxidermy is kind of a stand-in. I know we're almost out of time, but it's kind of a stand-in for me for the fact that, as a writer, I always want my readers to be surprised, but I can't very well surprise them if I'm not surprised myself. And so I did experience genuine surprise, including discovering that taxidermy is an incredible art form, or discovering that there are different ways to make a mount, just like there are different ways to write a book. And I interviewed some people who were all about, we have to make this as efficient as we can and crank out as many of these things as we can. And I talked to other people who were true master craftspeople who didn't care about volume or profit and were trying to honor a particular legacy in how they did their work. So as a writer, I did feel like I kind of resonated with that. So Nick, this has been just so great talking with you. And I think maybe we'll bring Lane in and see if we have time for questions. But
thanks, Mike.
Thank you so much for all those great questions about the book. It's really fun to see.
I didn't even ask the ones I wanted to get to.
Yeah, well, so about that, you, Nick, have been basically just asking all the questions that I had prepared, except in a much better fashion. So I think I'm really only going to, I have like one thing to share, and then I'm just going to, let you keep going, Nick. And as If anybody in the audience has any questions, they can put them in the Q&A, but I think we'll go till about 7:30 here. So
Okay.
we can definitely get in another couple of questions because it's been such a pleasure listening to both of you talk about this. But earlier today, I got an email from a customer of ours who lives in Portland that I'll read. I don't think it's going to end up being worth it sharing my screen. Yeah, probably not, but I'll read this off. I was reading about Michael Branch's visit and book, and it took me back to 1981 when I was a college student at the University of Wyoming, majoring in Parks and Recreation Administration. We had a class requiring us to work in groups and create a museum display for the public to view and then vote for their favorite display. My group, 3 of us in all, chose to do myths and legends of Wyoming, to which our instructor frowned upon. We did an impressive job of creating a scene with a forest and a lake in which we displayed our 3 myths and legend: the Wyoming owl, the furry trout, and the jackalope. I was in charge of the jackalope. When we went to the taxidermist to borrow one for our display, he had an information sheet with a jackalope story, which I used in our display. My teammates had to completely create their own information on the furry trout and the Wyoming owl. Remember, it was 1981 and the internet was not around to help us out, and we had little time and didn't find much of anything in actual research, which is why my teammates resorted to creativity and I used the information sheet I found at the taxidermist. So, rest of the story is short. We got the most votes on our display and the teacher had to reluctantly give us an A on our project, but her comment was we could have done better research, especially on the jackalope. And she included an image of a construction paper circle with another sheet of paper with, you burn the edges of with a lighter, and what I guess I presume is typewritten, not printed, jackalope. This rare animal was spotted 125 years ago and is found only in Wyoming. Only the males have antlers and mating occurs during lightning flashes of a spring thunderstorm. If you are a hunter with good luck, 34% fewer cavities, 47% more brains, and a lot of time, you too can catch a jackalope. And I just thought she hoped that you would get a kick out of that, and I certainly did reading it. But this does lead me to a question, and in your sort of just talking to the myriad different types of people that you talk to for this book, were there any other sort of Western mythological animals that either you had known about before but that you learned more about that particularly stood out, or that you hadn't heard about before?
Well, when I did research, first of all, thank you so much for sharing that. Part of what's been cool about this project is, people find out I'm the jackalope guy, and I get emails from all over the world saying, oh, sometimes it's people straight faced. I want to tell you about this time I had this encounter with a jackalope, or I don't know if you were aware of this aspect. So, people really want to share these stories, and almost everybody seems to have a jackalope story. But as it turns out, in the 19th century, there were dozens of imagined animals, especially in the American West. And I list some of these in the book, and I say in the book, most Americans won't even recognize these names, the Dunger Hoover and the Sidehill Gouger and all these sort of crazy things. And especially in the American West, the tall tale has been really important to our culture. And we have a big landscape where anything feels possible. And so we have big stories of lots of things feeling possible. So part of what was fun for me was to see that the jackalope is actually part of this long tradition of imaginary animals in the West. Some of them are taxidermy hoaxes, like the furred trout that you mentioned. But there's plenty of others that are just plain invented and used as part of these outrageous stories. So that's part of what I do with the jackalope in the book that's a little different, is I don't get stuck on the artifact of the jackalope. I get really interested in, how many people are really going to put a mount up on their wall? That's not what is going to perpetuate this thing. It's going to be these outrageous folk narratives about it. And so that's been really fun. And I think, yes, I learned about lots of other imaginary creatures in the West, and it made me see the jackalope as really part of a tribe, part of a tradition that we have, that I would worry about us losing, because I think it's really a fun and important part of who we are, especially in the West.
Yeah. Go ahead, Nick.
Oh, I was just gonna say it's a dream of mine to teach a seminar on anomalous animal literature, and I'm just so thankful this book exists so that it can slot it in there, along with now we need one on the furry trout, which I hadn't heard much about, but it actually I thought of the way fish, when they get scarred, they can also develop a fungus that kind of looks furry, and it made me think about, oh yeah, there are these reasons in nature for some of these legends. It would probably in case of every anomalous animal, cryptid as you call them.
And that's
Mike,
part of what's fun about the jackalope, I think, is that unlike some imaginary animals, until you're in on the joke, it just looks possible. There's a great line in the book where I'm interviewing somebody and I say, why do you think people love jackalopes? And she says, because they're as real as you want them to be. And, when people aren't in on the jackalope hoax yet, and they're studying these mounts, especially when there's somebody who is telling them stories to go with it, the jackalope just looks like it could exist. And so I've started this thing now where, I'm telling everybody that I want to work with several environmental groups here in the Great Basin to create a Jackalope Reserve. And the argument that I make is that if we set aside prime jackalope habitat here in the Great Basin to make sure that the species can survive, we'll simultaneously be protecting habitat for lots of other animals like desert tortoises and endangered plants. And we'll also be creating a kind of habitat for the imagination. And that to me is a cool part of this. My friend Bob Pyle, who Nick, is a wonderful writer from the Pacific Northwest. And he writes about Bigfoot, and he ultimately says, well, I don't know if Bigfoot exists or not, but I know that we need to have enough wilderness that we can wonder. And so I really like that about the jackalope, that it is something that we can enjoy, but also it exists in that liminal zone between the real and the imaginary. It's imagined enough that it can't be real, but it looks like it could be real enough that we wonder if we're only imagining it. And so ultimately my argument is, why choose between the two? The work of the imagination is real work, and the jackalope does exist. And that's another great line from the first chapter, where I interview the woman in Douglas who's at the visitor center. And I ask her, what's the experience you have when the tourists come in here? And she says, well, they always come in and they point at these mounts and they say, are those real? And I tell them, yes, they're real. They're real jackalopes. And I just love that way of looking at it, right? Because they are real jackalopes. So I think pushing at that line between what's real and what's imagined was part of what was so fun about this project.
Yeah, I have two things to say about that. I grew up in a house that, we had a big map of the United States on the wall with pins in it wherever there were Bigfoot sightings. And this, I just grew up in a household where that was a thing. And that was, one of the driving things behind our backpacking trips was we would put up wildlife cameras for that. And I have to admit that I somehow, I didn't engage much with jackalope stories when as a child, but I have made it through, I'm 30 now, I made it up to this book without ever definitively really being told that a jackalope is not a real thing. And it is totally one of those things where you're like, well, if a narwhal is real, and so, yeah, the story of the woman learning from her grandmother or having to talk to her grandmother about jackalope not being real. I can relate to that.
Yeah. And Lane, I love your point too. It's like in a world where, there are just wonders beyond the imagination. And I use examples, right? Like a hummingbird in flight, or, they're a pronghorn running 60 miles an hour. I mean, the natural world is full of these things that are so amazing. How is it possible that they even exist, right? And so, yeah, in a world where all of that exists, why not this? And I love your example of a narwhal, right? If you told somebody about a narwhal, they would not believe you. And yet there it is. And I use the example in the book actually of a platypus, because when they first collected specimens of the platypus and sent them back to Europe, the naturalists who examined them were suspicious that they were taxidermy hoaxes, because they said, well, this thing has a bill like one kind of animal. It has a body like another. It lays eggs. This doesn't make sense. It must be a hoax. And so I sort of make the point in the book that, hey, in a world where a platypus can exist, why not a jackalope? So I think kind of blurring those boundaries is good for us. And the fact that you held on for so long to, to a feeling that maybe this thing exists, I think is important, because in the book, ultimately, I want to give that back to people again and say, well, there is a sense in which it does exist, because the work of the imagination is real work. We have jackalopes because we need them. We invented them because we need them. And so, you needed your Bigfoot map, and, I need horned rabbits, and I want to live in a world where outrageous things are possible. I just think that just makes me happy.
The horned rabbit does exist.
Right.
That's the crazy thing of it. It's such a a hall of mirrors.
Yeah.
And that's what's beautiful about the book. Lane, you're obviously like you're the target audience for this book. If you had a Bigfoot exciting map of it.
Yeah,
that's amazing.
Very much so. Nick, I think we've got time for one or two more questions if you had any.
Yeah, I've got two. One is not, well, it's actually, this is the most serious one. Mike, what are you prepared for the even larger deluge of Jackalopiana, as you call it, the jackalope materials that you are about to receive from all directions? I mean, and if you are prepared, what are you going to do with it? You've already written the book. Are you going to make it a museum, or even if it's only virtual? But this seems like this is a life or death question for you, because you're going to be you're up against the wall. It's coming at you.
Oh, listen, my family has already staged an intervention with me, because the amount of jackalope junk that I have acquired, it's irresistible. And you might be familiar with Wall Drug up in South Dakota, and I make a pilgrimage there because it's the greatest jackalope junk emporium in the world. And I make friends with the family who owns it. And now those guys just mail me jackalope t-shirts all the time, every time they get a new design in. And but yeah, it's everywhere, and it's pretty irresistible. So sometimes I am asked, like, not just in terms of the kitsch, but what's it like to be the jackalope guy, and what'll happen now, because a lot of interviews are being published, and spin-offs and stuff. And I say bring it on, because it's been so fun, and the interviews in the book are so fun that I feel like there's almost a community of people who help me to tell the story. And every time I get I got an email this morning from somebody I've never met who wanted to tell me a jackalope story. And, to me, that's been part of what has been so rewarding about the project, especially because it was my COVID book, right? This is the book that I wrote in isolation, and having people reach out from literally all over the world. Hey, I live in Bavaria. Do you know we have a horned rabbit called a Wolpertinger, and then I have a correspondence with Bavarians about horned rabbits in the German forest. And that's just been a really neat part of the project. So I'm going to try to cut down on the acquisition of kitsch before I get in real trouble around here in my family. But so far as the narratives, I hope they keep flowing in, and I hope they keep growing and changing with the years.
It would almost be an interesting experiment for you, Mike, to get a PO box and say, send your jackalope stuff here, and see what you get. I mean, you might have a world-class, you already have a world-class museum, but it could be out of this world. You're going to have fans, and they're going to want to send you more t-shirts.
Go to my website and mail me stuff. I'm ready.
Okay. If there's time, I've got one more question, and Lane, is there time?
Oh yeah.
Okay. In your discussion, your description of this is your COVID book, as you say, and in some ways in more ways than one, because you are talking about viruses in a really substantive way. And I had hoped we'd have time to talk about that science writing, and we don't. But how did writing about viruses in the midst of this pandemic, and you profile the Spanish flu more. And you don't really get into COVID much for various reasons, but how did that shape your thinking about the virus discussion, and how did it change the book?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question to end on too. Just to back up a second, Richard Shope, the guy who is the first virologist to ever study horned rabbits, he was the guy who figured out what caused the Spanish flu, which is a misnomer, but the global pandemic of 1918, which killed between 50 and 100 million people. It took about 16 years after the fact before he figured it out, but he was the guy who figured it out. And that was how he first got on my radar. I was like, okay, the COVID pandemic is raging. I want to learn more about the 1918 pandemic. What was the deal with that? Well, who worked on that? This guy. But there was no way in writing about a virus and the man who sort of explained the last giant global pandemic, there was just no way to avoid this. And especially when I got to writing about the HPV vaccine, I was absolutely committed to not letting the book become a vaccine polemic. And yet at the same time, I know that, 350,000 people a year still die of cervical cancer. Cervical cancer is caused almost exclusively by the HPV virus. 90% of HPV-caused cancers are preventable with the virus. So in other words, lots and lots of folks are dying of what is essentially now an almost entirely preventable disease. So my piece recently in the San Francisco Chronicle is all about this. So I do hope that the book will be fun, that it'll be entertaining, but I hope that every book I write is also doing a little something to make the world a better place. And I don't want to get in people's faces, but I analyze in the book, mostly with interviews with other folks. I take a look at HPV vaccine hesitancy and the reasons for it. And I hope that the COVID vaccine hesitancy conversation is hovering right over that. But I have found that I have honestly given up on polemic. I just think preaching at people is ineffective. But I would be lying if I didn't say that I hope that the way I put it at the end of an interview recently is somebody said, well, what do you want your book to accomplish? And I said, well, I want it to entertain people or I want it to save somebody's daughter's life. And either way is fine with me. So I think that's a nice spot to end because the larger project of doing the kind of science writing that I do is how can I use funny, quirky, weird, cool, engaging stuff to ultimately lead people into a conversation that could save somebody's life. So anyway, we'll leave it at that. But I want to say again, Nick, how much I've enjoyed the conversation and really thank Lane and Jess again. And everybody out there, again, whether it's Nick's book, Alta California, which is wonderful, or the Jackalope book, or any other book, you guys, please keep supporting your independent bookstores. They're a vital part of our communities. And I just want to thank you guys for the work that you do in the community, and thank you for having me with you.
Mike, thank you. I mean, this like the Jackalope, this book is a remarkable work of wonder and resistance, and humor as a part of both. And I just thank you for writing it, for showing us what the Jackalope really is and exploring its shadow, its long shadow.
Well, thanks. This has been super fun. Thanks to everybody who helped put this on.
Lane, thank you very much. Thanks to Books Northwest. What a great idea it is to have these collective Zoom conversations and readings.
Yeah, thank you both for joining us, and thank you to everybody who tuned in tonight. Just a reminder, you can find a recording of the event at our YouTube page, Books in Common Northwest, on the search bar on YouTube there. And just thank you again, both. I wish we could go for like another hour. It's been so great listening to both of you.
I'm on board. We don't have to stop. This is
and we'll also certainly, as we hopefully start to get back in the swing of in-person events in the near-ish future, we'll work on getting both of you up to Sisters and over to Sisters for Nick. And it's been great. And thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you all next time.
We'd love that. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.